Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
hi.
Today I have with me a gentleman from Haifa whose name is Omer Belsky. And maybe you'd like to say a little something about yourself.
Yeah, sure, Baruch. Thank you for having me, for hosting me.
My
Uh,
pleasure.
I'm I'm 44. I have three kids. As you said, I
Yeah,
live in Haifa. I studied both in Israel and in Belgium, and I run family business, which is about importing machinery, heavy machinery to Israel.
yes.
That's short of me, and we met on the forum for Israel Palestine, where I'm pretty active.
Now, when we had a discussion last week, one issue that you brought up, and this is a very difficult issue for people who are idealistic, do dream of peace one day between Israelis and Palestinians, which is that there's a huge difference in the mindset between the way many Palestinians think and the way many Israelis think.
Yeah, yeah, one of the maybe the most noticeable thing that I have both in the forums and also more generally reading and about the conflict and talking, especially online, is this huge gap of how Israelis and Palestinians basically we are not I mean we're not communicating. We're living in a way in a completely different reality, and we see things
Hmm.
so completely different that even communication, even though everybody speaks English, uh, communication
Hmm.
is basically very near impossible. It's very it seems to me that this is one of the reasons for sure that the conflict is not going in positive direction. Let's put it like that.
Do you have any examples?
There's a sense among Palestinians that something is going to change in their favor relatively soon.
Hmm.
You see this, for example, there was a survey I read a while ago that Israel had its 75th Independence Day a couple of years ago, and there was a
Yes.
survey among Palestinians: do you believe Israel will be around to be 100? And like a majority said, no, we don't think so. There's not going to be Israel in 25 years. That to
Hmm.
me, I think to any Israeli, that sounds like you completely are not understanding anything about, or it sounds, let's say, it sounds very far-fetched. Let's say it's like this.
Hmm.
And it's generally like this. Like
Hmm.
there's a bunch of demonstration, soon the coming generation in the US is gonna, stop all the support for Israel, and Israel will be driven completely, without the US support will be completely nothing. Whereas if you look
Hmm.
at the survey,
Well, my experience living in England is Israel and Palestine, although it's in the news a lot, it isn't what most people are talking about. You talk to the average English person, they probably just have an idea of this conflict going on somewhere. They're upset when they see people being killed, but they're probably not passionate about either side in the conflict.
exactly, it's just not that.
Hmm.
I mean, there's some people who are very intense about this,
Sure.
but that's not going to be that there's a rising generation that is going to force Israel to either, self-destruct or at the very least to give away all of West Bank and Gaza. It's just not, I mean,
Hmm.
the political will to actively pursue a very aggressive policy, that's not going to be realistic. That's not what people care about. It's not going to happen. But Palestinians believe, and they really believe, the world is seeing what's happening, and it's changing and it's moving, and
Hmm.
they really believe this. For me, I think it looks like there will be change. There always changes, but this belief that the young generation is knights and with shining armor that's going to come and save Palestine. That just sounds to me completely wishful thinking.
I suspect what you may see is less interest in support for Israel in America because of changing demographics, perhaps changing attitudes among a new generation of Jews who feel less connected with Israel, possibly changing attitudes among evangelical Christians. But I don't think you're likely to see a huge mainstream support for Palestine. I think Americans are more interested in America than they are in Palestine and Israel.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. But talk to the people who are supportive of Palestinian, you get a completely different attitude. Or, for example,
Hmm.
if you want another example, you can talk about the current war in Gaza. On one hand, it's genocide and it's completely unprecedented, and how come nobody does anything? But then you say,
Hmm.
okay, but Hamas started it, and then suddenly, okay, no, October 7th is not the beginning of anything, right? I mean, October 7th is just another day in the normal life of the conflict, which to me is like whatever you want to say. This October 7th marks a huge dramatic escalation of the conflict.
I agree that October the 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. I agree it was not the start of the conflict, but certainly it's like I can give explanations for it, but I don't want to make I don't want to make excuses for it.
I'm not talking in a moral sense. I'm just saying, as
Yeah.
a factual thing, October 7th marks a new and infinitely more deadly uh, stage of the conflict. It changed the conflict from a low intensity conflict with relatively few people dying. I mean, there were
Hmm.
like 200 something Palestinian casualties until October 7th in total, including
Yes.
terrorists, including innocents. Everything together is 200 and something.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's like sometimes it could happen in one day now. Whatever you want to say. There were 50,000 casualties in the year and a half of the
Hmm.
war. Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, in Israel, we had 20, 30 casualties in 2023 before October 7th. Now we had
Hmm.
2,000. But no, if you ask Palestinians, they're almost never willing to acknowledge it. I heard an interview the other day when one of Palestinian, and a fairly reasonable Palestinians, he says, if October 7th hadn't happened, Israel would have done what it does to Gaza anyway. It means you completely misunderstand anything about Israel. There's no way. Israel was
Hmm.
very happy to leave Gaza as it was before October 7th. They
Hmm.
were in the, almost 10 years, 9 years since the last major war or merger round of 2014. Things were gradually getting better. And,
Hmm.
Hamas were saying, very clearly, we were pretending to be reasonable, and that what we care about is development in order to lull Israelis into a. And it's not somebody who's excusing October 7th or supports Hamas or anything else, but the view is, I mean, it's basically an excuse that would have happened anyway. That's like you completely not understand anything about Israel. There's no
Hmm.
chance in a million years that something this dramatic would have happened. Israel was very happy to leave Gaza, basically not alone because it was blockaded in a way, but and there were, counter-terrorism action and stuff like that, but there was no interest in Israel by basically anyone to re-enter Gaza and to reoccupy Gaza. That was completely off the until 6:30 in the morning on October 7th, 2023. It was completely off the radar of anybody.
I find it difficult to understand what was in Hamas's mind when it launched October the 7th, and what was in the minds of the people who thought, great, we've scored a victory against Israel. If I was in Gaza and I saw what happened, I'd be terrified because I know what's going to come next.
Well, I mean, the one thing I would say about the
Hmm.
ordinary people is that
Hmm.
it's not I mean, there are all these pictures of the celebration and stuff, but it's
Hmm.
not clear how much they knew about what was happening. I
Hmm.
mean, when you see these people celebrating in the streets when the Hamas cars come with, abductees like Shani Lok and people like that,
Hmm.
uh, I'm not sure everybody who was celebrating I mean, they realized there was some kind of a raid, but did they know about, the massacres? Did they know about
Hmm.
the
I'm
extent of the
sure a lot of
killing?
people, when you see the pictures, you see the people who came out on the streets.
Yeah,
Not everybody would have come out on the streets. Some of the people who are coming out on the streets may have just been looking to see what was going on.
yeah.
So it doesn't follow because you see crowds celebrating either, as you say, that they know exactly what's happened, or that that represents all people in Gaza.
No, for sure, it doesn't represent all people in Gaza.
Um,
But on the other hand, there
mhm,
were a lot. I mean, and you can see, for example, on Twitter, what
mhm,
used to be called Twitter, accounts of later in the day when there were people abducted, and the people saying, it's the greatest day. We're taking back Palestine. Bring me back.
mhm,
I mean, there were definitely some people who maybe were celebrating without exactly understanding what was happening, but there were also
mhm.
lots of people who were celebrating and they knew, maybe not exactly, but they knew quite a bit of what was happening.
But to not be terrified of what they knew was going to happen,
Yeah,
that's what I
exactly.
find
Exactly. Yeah.
hard. I can understand that people in Gaza hated Israelis.
Yeah.
Um, Gaza might have been pretty nice before October the 7th compared to what it is now. But compared to your life in Haifa, my life in London, it was still a pretty scary place to be, a pretty grim place to be, a pretty degrading place to be.
It was getting gradually better as, in the 9 years since in 2014, there was a big round of fighting between Israel
Yes.
and Hamas. And then they had 9 years of relatively calm. And things were
Mhm,
gradually getting better in Gaza. They
mhm,
opened desalination plants and got clean water.
mhm,
They fixed the water in the sea so people could bathe. They let 20,000 Palestinian workers into Israel, where they got relative, I mean, very high paid. Life in Gaza was not easy, but things were getting better, and of course would have been much better had
I
some
wonder
of the
if there
money
may be a
been spent
yeah.
development instead of on these huge underground tunnels that they were building this metropolis under the ground. But things were anyway were getting better in Gaza
I
until October
wonder
7th.
if there could be a difference in the news that you would have been getting in Israel and that we were getting in the UK. I was aware that Israel was accepting more workers in the final couple of years before October the 7th, but I certainly didn't have an impression that life in Gaza was getting better. On questions of things like clean water, we had an impression it was at breaking point. It was constant power cuts. So I wonder how much life was getting better for the ordinary person.
I'm not going to say it was not bad. But Gaza was a lot poorer than the West Bank. It's always been, but certainly it deteriorated in the years after since
Hmm.
Hamas took over. But they were opening desalination waters. It's easy to find it. They had desalination plants and they got clean water. They managed to fix the beaches so people could go to the beach. I'm not going to say here that life in Gaza was good. It wasn't. And I would
Hmm.
not want to live as Gazan did. But
Hmm.
if you look at the pictures, it was not terrible and it was getting better. The debate in Israel, even in this very right-wing government that we had before October 7th, was about,
Hmm.
allowing more workers in and easing the blockade more and letting
Hmm.
food more in. I mean, for sure, I'm sure that a typical Palestinian would say 2023 was better than 2015. For sure, in every criteria, things were getting better.
When you say every Palestinian, was it getting better in your view in the West Bank as well as in Gaza?
That's a much tougher question
Hmm.
because whereas Israel was very happy to leave Gaza basically alone and to its stuff, Israel always, and certainly with this new government in an increasing fashion, had plans to take over more and more areas in the West Bank
Hmm.
and expel Palestinians, at least from some areas, like in
Hmm.
Safar Yatta, which is now famous because of the Oscar-winning documentary, but also other places where there's settler violence, and certainly with this new
Hmm.
government, what sometimes was happening before probably happened more, that there was at least tacit encouragement by Israeli military to settler actions and sometimes complete cooperation between the IDF and the settlers. Not everywhere, not all the times, but certainly sometimes and in some places.
Certainly, one thing I hear again and again, and I do believe is happening at least some of the time, is when Palestinians complain, settlers come and commit all sorts of violent destruction, and the soldiers are just standing by and doing nothing.
They say it's the Wild East about the West
Hmm.
Bank in many ways. And
Hmm.
certainly but it's gotten much worse now. After October
Hmm.
7th, there's much less patience for these kind of things. And by the way, the previous US administration, it put sanctions against some settlers who were involved in this kind of violence, and the Trump administration canceled these things.
That I recall. So you talk about this distorted sense of reality where Palestinians think, oh, Americans are going to turn against Israel in a few years. Israel isn't going to last till its 100th anniversary. I think that I've heard some equally delusional ideas from pro-Israel supporters. Two that come to mind. One is Trump's plan for Gaza. Gaza's going to be the next Riviera. We can move the Gazans to Jordan or Egypt. Why shouldn't they take them in? To me, that seems like not only doesn't it solve the problem, because any Gazans that would be willing to move to Egypt or Jordan are those that aren't going to be a threat if they stay in Gaza. But it doesn't solve getting rid of Hamas. And why on earth should Egypt and Jordan take in 2 million Gazans? Yet I hear that idea discussed pretty seriously, as if it's quite a reasonable thing. The other thing that I see is you've had protests in Gaza against Hamas by a few hundred people, and that's portrayed as the whole of Gaza is turning against Hamas. And privately, I'm sure a lot, if not most Gazans are fed up with Hamas because what they've been through. But the idea that this is suddenly this massive new movement seems to be totally delusional.
Well, I would say about the second point, which I really don't know.
Mm,
It's very difficult
mhm,
to know what exactly is happening in Gaza and
mhm.
and, and what is not exactly. But I would say two things. First, that it requires incredible courage to go publicly open face against Hamas. And the
I'm
fact that
certainly not
hundreds
disputing the courage of the people
and so
going
no,
out
so I was
there.
saying the fact that hundreds of people are willing to do it in an open way, which is something that, let's say, would have been inconceivable 2 years ago, right? There's no way something
Hmm.
like this could have happened 2 years ago. It
Hmm.
marks some kind of shift. How big a shift, I don't know, but you cannot imagine 2 years ago hundreds of people standing out publicly aggressively against Hamas. This is something that this is something new. How
Hmm.
significant, I don't know, but definitely something didn't happen. And
Hmm.
second, that, one of the things about dictatorships, and Hamas is a dictatorship, is that
Hmm.
sometimes they fall and collapse very rapidly. I mean, we've seen it in Syria. I would not have imagined,
Hmm.
I would
Yeah.
not have imagined anything happened to Assad regime. It looked very
Hmm.
solid, right? And then it
Hmm.
collapsed in
Hmm.
2 weeks or something. So I'm not
Hmm.
saying this is going to happen in to Hamas at all,
Hmm.
but that the the level that we don't understand what's happening and find it difficult to predict what's happening in Gaza. I mean, that's something that should be taken in mind. It's difficult to understand.
Hmm.
I mean, reportage is difficult.
Hmm.
Survey
Yeah.
statistics are difficult to understand. It's very difficult to know
Yeah.
exactly what's happening.
I'd certainly share um, your surprise that the Assad regime collapsed so suddenly. Apparently, because it suddenly found itself without significant Hezbollah support. What worries me more than if Palestinians think Israel's not going to survive is that among many Palestinians, there seems to be a complete unwillingness to compromise to any significant degree or even to humanize Israelis. So it's like the Israelis are this implacable enemy. We can't live with them or have a two-state solution or have any compromise with Israel. We just have to defeat Israel and for the Israelis to leave. Maybe native Palestinian Jews who were there before 1948 can stay. There is this complete inability that I see to meet Israel halfway.
Yeah, I mean, I for sure a very strong sentiment among Palestinians, but I think
Hmm.
it comes from the same place. I mean, if you think in 25 years there's not going to be any Israel, why would you compromise with it, right? Just have to wait, and soon something or somebody will save you. So what's the point in trying to appeal to Israelis? What's the point in trying to compromise? You're going to win
Well,
anyway.
if I thought in 25 years Israel will be ethnically cleansed of Palestinians, I would rather a future where Israelis live peacefully with Palestinians. So I don't believe in making peace with Palestinians because I don't think we can defeat them. I'm in favor of Israel making peace with Palestinians because that's the right thing to do, if it's possible.
I mean, for most, I would say both Israelis and Palestinians, I mean, the level of hate and hostility
Hmm.
is too great for that. It strikes me as unrealistic. To live
Whether it's
together,
realistic,
is
yeah.
is let's say a necessary evil for most Israelis and Palestinians, right? I mean,
Hmm.
they have to give up a lot of their land,
Hmm.
which they consider their land. They have
Hmm.
to forgive terrible crimes committed against
Hmm.
them. Uh,
Yes.
Maybe they're willing to do it because, to have a better future and to stop the bloodshed and for
Hmm.
pragmatic and reasons.
Hmm.
But to say that they want to do it out of love for the other side or altruism, I think that's a little bit beyond human nature.
My response to that would be Desmond Tutu saying Israel won't be free until Palestine is free. And I think there's a very important sense in which that's true. Until everybody is treated as a human being, there's, I think, a sense in which nobody is free.
I think that's a very idealistic John Donne kind of statement, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I don't think it's the kind of thing people who are facing, the terrors of the war and the stuff.
I'd put it slightly differently. If the Palestinians were genuine about peace, would you be prepared to have a two-state solution? I think a lot of Israelis, well, I know a lot of Israelis, possibly a majority, would say yes. What most Israelis will tell you is that the Palestinians don't want a two-state solution. They want all of Israel, and that's not going to bring peace.
Yeah.
But certainly, what I want is everybody to be treated like human beings between the river and the sea, not for Israel to eventually drive out all the Palestinians. And if that's what Israelis want to do, then I can understand why Palestinians are reluctant to make compromises.
So I didn't understand the last.
If Israelis ideologically want to drive Palestinians out of between the river and the sea, then that makes Palestinian violent resistance much more understandable. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, there is a section in Israel that
Hmm.
supports, let's say, the greater Israel.
Hmm.
And this is a very politically powerful section,
Yeah.
but it's not the majority.
Hmm.
The majority of the right-wing government is working for security. I would say security is the key
Hmm.
to
Yes.
the even in this government. The security argument is the key card. The greater
Hmm.
Israel is not a dream shared by most Israelis.
I would think a lot of Israelis are not very interested in things like borders and territory. They just want to feel safe.
Yeah, the attachment to the
Hmm.
West Bank and to
Hmm.
Gaza is not great. Security is paramount. I mean, the
Hmm.
disengagement, which was okay 20 years
Hmm.
ago, but it had like
Hmm.
70 something percentage support. The disengagement of from Gaza in
Oh, so
2005.
that was, you mean back in 2005?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think theoretically, if you could convince Israeli Jews that a retreat to a two-state solution would actually guarantee security, it
Hmm.
would win convincingly in any poll.
Now, one thing you emphasized when I spoke to you last week was the difference between attitudes among Arab citizens of Israel, of whom there are a large number in the city in which you live, and Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Do you want to say something about how attitudes differ?
Yeah, I think, okay, of course, it's a diverse group, and to make
Hmm.
these generalization is difficult. But I would say, as Israeli Palestinians or Arabs, they're attuned to a great extent to Israeli society, right? I mean, they know they work with Jews, they speak Hebrew, they have it good under the system. I mean, even if they don't like, for example, I talk to Arab people I work with, and they say after October 7th, Israel had to respond, even if they don't agree to the war and how it's pursued and anything. There's understanding that October 7th is there had to be a response. I don't think if you ask Palestinians whether Israel had to respond militarily to October 7th, you would get many of them would say yes. So there's much more understanding to Jewish Israeli point of view, which is not to say complete agreement, but there's more understanding. I've not seen surveys, but I don't think if you ask Arab Israelis, will Israel be celebrating its 100th anniversary, I think most Arab Israelis would say yes.
You know the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research,
I think so, I'm not sure.
PCPSR?
I think so.
They mainly carry out surveys of Palestinians, and they have even managed to continue doing surveys in Gaza since October the 7th. And they some occasionally collaborate with Israeli organizations to do surveys in Israel. And there are some surveys that ask questions specifically to Arab Israelis. And certainly you see a much more moderate attitude from Arab citizens than you see from Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza.
Hmm.
The other place that I've seen that is Corey Jill Shuster, who runs the Ask Project and asks questions from members of the public to Palestinians on the West Bank, to Jewish Israelis, and to Israeli Arabs. And there you see a huge contrast between what Israeli Arabs say and what West Bank Arabs say.
There's more understanding about Israeli point
Hmm.
of view.
Yeah.
There is a certain identification with the state of
Hmm.
Israel. It's ambivalent, it's not the same to everybody. I would guess most Israeli Arabs are ambivalent about their Israeli identity. They were shocked by October 7th. They're exposed to the horrors of October 7th.
Do you remember at all the peace years between Oslo and the start of the Al-Aqsa
Yeah.
Intifada? And during that time, do you recall different attitudes either on the part of Israelis or on the part of Palestinians?
It's first hard to say in Israel because I mean, the demographic shift in Israel is so huge that it's
Hmm.
difficult to say. Israel is moved demographically is a much more religious and right-wing country than it was 20 years ago. There
You're thinking
was,
because religious people have more children, so that they're now a high proportion of the population.
yeah. For certainly there was a lot of optimism in the 1990s, even certainly
Hmm.
before the Al-Aqsa Intifada, maybe a little bit during the disengagement plan, there was an idea that there was hope that some kind of agreement would be
Hmm.
reached at some point. And I don't know when exactly, but this has died completely. I think 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, if you ask the typical Israelis, what are the odds that there will be a peace treaty with Palestinians in the next 40 years? I
Hmm.
don't know what the number would be, but it would be a lot higher. But even before, even if you asked 6 months before October 7th, I'm sure the people have become much more pessimistic about the chances of for peace.
Certainly, I believed that there would be peace during the peace years. And even when the Al-Aqsa Intifada started. I wouldn't say I was still optimistic in 2005, but for the first couple of years, I thought, oh, they got to get back to the negotiating table. They're not going to carry on like this. So certainly I feel I was very wrong. Coming from a British perspective, at the same time, the 1990s were when we were having peace talks in Northern Ireland, which eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement and did bring pretty much peace in Northern Ireland. So my optimism was justified on that score, but I'd never have expected things would just go south so badly.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tragedy.
One question that occurs to me is you have in Arab citizens of Israel people who both get Israel and can see the advantages of peaceful cooperation with their Jewish neighbors in Israel and can see a future for themselves in Israel, even if they don't necessarily identify as Israeli. But these are also people who are going to have family, often close family, in the West Bank and Gaza, and are hearing their stories and understand their attitudes. Why are we not making more use of Arab citizens of Israel in terms of how to have more understanding between Israelis and Palestinians, how you might create a peace that might work? They seem to be the people that might have the answers because they're the people that can really get both sides.
There's no organized role for play for this kind of thing. Certainly the last, since Netanyahu came back in power in
Yeah,
2009, there's just
yeah,
no interest in Israel for any kind of peace agreement
right.
whatsoever. So there's no, I mean, you're not going to promote peace if you're not interested in peace.
I'm thinking more at a grassroots level here. There certainly are people in Israel that want peace and want to believe that there are people, there are counterparts on the other side that they can talk to.
I'm hesitating to say too much, but these groups are tiny, very unrepresentative of anything. I
Hmm.
mean, uh, Meretz got wiped out of the last Knesset. It got like 120,000 voters or something. They are doing the active. They have a whole bunch of groups and organizations. And there are all sorts of initiatives for Israeli Palestinians interactions, but it's a tiny group.
Hmm. But it seems to me that this is a voice that isn't heard and has something important to contribute. Because at some point, unless Israel ethnically cleanses Palestinians between the river and the sea or completely subdues them, and then you have to keep people in permanent subjection, which is a very taxing thing to do. You are going to have some deal someday.
I don't think today there is appetite in
Mm.
Israel for
Mhm.
certainly after October 7th.
Now, you say when you talk to your Arab colleagues, they agree there needed to be a response to October the 7th. What are your feelings about the response to October the 7th?
I'm one
What
of
should
these.
have been the response? Could it have been different?
Again, I'm one of these relatively tiny minority that still believes in
Hmm.
cooperation with the Palestinian Authority and in this
Yeah.
two-state solution. And I would have liked to see the war against Hamas fought within a framework that cooperates with the Palestinian Authority and moved towards at least greater autonomy for Palestinians in West Bank and the entry of the PA into Gaza. But, the Israeli government is not interested in a vision like this.
But they don't seem to have an alternative vision. They're not prepared to run Gaza themselves.
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think they are. But most of my right-wing friends in real life, definitely in social media, they really
Hmm.
believe that Israel will be able to put enough pressure on Hamas to break it in some
Hmm.
way or another.
Short of completely defeating Hamas and resettling Gaza, does Israel have the appetite? Well, I think the far right want to, yeah, short of making Gaza the next, of completely defeating Hamas and resettling Gaza, does Israel have the appetite for the headache of governing Gaza?
I don't think they are there yet. For the Israeli right wing, the picture is something like, World War II or something like that. You're waiting to push Hamas to the breaking point that they will
Yeah.
surrender in
Hmm.
some form. The focus is not on a post-war plan. The focus is on putting enough pressure on Hamas to make Hamas in some way surrender, maybe agree to evacuate Gaza.
Which, if it wasn't for the toll on civilians in Gaza, I wouldn't have a problem with. What I've been unable to accept since October the 7th is the enormity of loss of life, complete destruction of life, traumatization that has been caused to everyone in Gaza.
I would say for me, the big question is, does it serve any purpose? Will it actually lead to a real defeat for Hamas and a real big change in the area? Or is it
Mm.
just a futile war that will end in some kind of return to the status quo antebellum, which is my view? How to assess this tragedy? I mean, the destruction of Germany during in
Mm.
1945 was terrible. It had a huge amount of loss of civilian life and destruction, but out of it came a much more prosperous and democratic and free and peaceful Europe.
But Euro and the same argument can well be made for Ukraine. This was a case of an existential threat. You will not survive. Either you will not survive physically, you'll be killed, or you will not survive as free people if you do not destroy this regime. With Hamas, I believe, first of all, that if Israel hadn't taken its eye off the ball, it could have prevented October the 7th. And after October the 7th, it was certainly capable of preventing another October the 7th by returning to what you call the antebellum, which, awful though it is hugely better than the awful destruction that we've seen in the past couple of years.
I mean, it's a slightly different argument, but I would say first, it's very difficult to imagine living side to side with Hamas after October
Mm.
7th. It's very
Right.
difficult to imagine a coexistence with something like that.
It wouldn't be a coexistence, it would be containment.
Yeah, but it's different. It's very after
There,
October
there,
7th.
there was never any coexistence with Hamas.
Well, I
Hamas
mean,
was always sworn to Israel's destruction.
living side to side with Hamas
Hmm.
after October 7th seems to most Israelis to be a very, very difficult concept to accept.
I get that, but what
Uh,
happened is so infinitely worse.
but that's the big question. If you
Yeah.
believe that we are solving the problem with this war, that it's actually destroying Hamas and something better will arise out of it, which is a belief in a big section of Israeli public, not, I don't know how big, but
Hmm.
certainly lots of people in Israel believe that
Hmm.
Hamas can be defeated or is in the way to being defeated. I
Hmm.
don't personally share this kind of view, but I know a lot of people, and I would not call them, unintelligent, who believe
Hmm.
that Hamas is being pushed. Maybe something better will come out of this. for everybody. I'm skeptical, but I didn't think the Assad regime would fall. Maybe the Hamas regime will fall
Hmm.
as well out of this pressure.
Hmm. Hmm. Anyway, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Absolutely.
So I think this is probably a good place to end for the evening.
Thank you so
But
much. It was a
but
pleasure.
we've covered a much wider range of topics than I thought we would.
We can talk. I have a feeling we can talk for a long time about many
Yeah,
subjects.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
And thank you.